All right. Good morning, everyone.
They have the wrong.
Is there any way to change that?
Do you guys have the correct?
We're just running it again.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect. We were going to pretend.
We could
Do an impersonation. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Lamb, and I'm Washington, D.C. Executive Director of Turnaround for Children. It's a great honor to be here with some leaders in this work. We have on the far end Melissa Kim, who is the Deputy Chancellor, Social, Emotional, and Academic Development for D.C. Public Schools. We have Chris Liang-Vergara, who's the Chief of Learning Innovation for Leap Innovations. We have Steve Merrill, who's the Chief Content Officer for Edutopia. And then right next to me, we have Matthew Peterson, who's the co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer for the Mind Research Institute. I'm supposed to create conflict as a moderator. That's what it says, but having done our prep conversation, that's going to be a really tall task because we have a lot of alignment in this group. Okay, excellent. So I'm hoping that you guys will challenge each other and push. I will do what I can to create that conflict and then bring it to resolution by the end, like a good moderator is supposed to do. So just as some opening framing for this work, we at Turnaround for Children like to say we have 1 foot in the science and 1 foot in schools. And our mission is to translate that science into practices, systems, strategies that educators can use to promote healthy student development and academic achievement. So this panel, this idea of translation is the core of the work that we do. And over the years, we've learned that we don't have an understanding problem or a curiosity problem for educators. We have a translation problem. There's so much great research out there, and yet it almost never gets into the hands of practitioners like me when I taught middle school 15 years ago. And so what I'm hoping that we can dive into is everyone's experience on how to bridge that translation to make sure that you're not just having a great platform or trying to do something well, but it's actually taking root with the educators that need to use them and with children that can really benefit from that. And what we often experience is when we do our kind of brain science 101 sessions, it causes some aha moment where people have this oh wow moment, and they start to reflect back on all the children that they interacted with in their career as educators, all the moves that they made, all the things that they said, all the work that they did with them, and they have this moment of wow. And so I want to start there. Matthew, would love to start with you, just in thinking about the science and how powerful the science can be. What was your aha moment? What was your big oh wow moment?
I was studying neuroscience, and I was talking to professors and experts in neuroscience. Can we use what we know about the brain to improve education? And the consensus... Crazy idea. And people that are not neuroscientists are like, yeah, of course you could do that. And then you talk to neuroscientists, and they're like, no, the bridge is too far. We're just talking about how these neurons work, and that doesn't translate into how to teach kids better. And so I kind of reluctantly bought into that. And I was talking to a famous neuroscientist, Joachim Fuster, who was talking about this. There's these connections between perception and action parts of your brain, these hierarchical connections that are, they're these reciprocal connections that are very active and form the basis of how the cortex works. And so it connects perception to action. And surely all classrooms are connecting perception to action. But then when you look at what's happening in the classrooms, so much is all through perception. I'm going to tell you something. And I'm going to read about something. You're trying to learn things through perception. And what students really need to do is they need to connect perception to action. So they need to do something and then perceive the results of what they do, and then adjust what they do based on what they perceive, and in a loop. And that's the perception action cycle, which is one of the most fundamental aspects of how the neocortex works. And yet, it's not happening in school.
Yeah.
And so that was a big aha. It's like these real core fundamental ideas about how the brain works, even those are not being implemented as they should in the school system. So for me, that was one of the big aha moments.
Wow. Steve, you spend your day telling stories, looking at narratives, connecting with educators, seeing what drives them. What's been your biggest aha moment about the connection between the science and practice?
Yeah, so I started way back when, decades ago. I try to keep it vague, decades ago, long time, for self-protective.
I see a potential conflict coming up.
And when I was right out of college and walked into the classroom and really felt like what I was there to do was, to teach kids how to write, teach kids how to comprehend, deconstruct, and parse language. I never thought about belonging. It never occurred to me, actually, that a welcoming classroom, a classroom that started foundationally with belonging, might outperform a classroom that was focused on rigor. Turns out that as I read the research and as I just think about it, it seems blindingly obvious to me. We just did a piece looking at research in 2018 that suggested that really simple acts that kind of nurture kids and make them feel welcome, like greeting kids at the door, can actually improve engagement by about 20 percentage points and decrease disruptive behavior by about 9 percentage points. And if you look even beyond the kind of grade school, middle school level, where that seems to make a lot of sense, we're not doing as good a job in high school, and we're just starting to talk about it in college. Now, I was in my office the other day. Someone walked by my door and said, "Hey, I've been watching your SEL stuff." And I said, "Well, what do you do?" She said, "I'm a college counselor." It's like, we're K12. I was like, "What are you doing watching our SEL stuff?" Which focuses on, there's a lot of middle school kids in there. Said it's become a really vital part of college. And if you look at what's happening at ASU in Georgia, University of Georgia, there's really a re-emphasis at the college level now as well on welcoming students and making sure belonging is there. And then the academics follow. I think teachers have known this for a long time, but it was kind of like, wow, it was a real aha moment for me. I didn't think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, you spend all your time trying to put innovations in the hands of educators in ways they can use. What's been your biggest aha moment?
I go back as well to undergrad. I was a biology and secondary education major, and my aha was I was almost like switching worlds. In my biology classes, I was reading first level research in the journals, in the stacks, really digging through it. And then in my teacher preparation, it was much more generalistic and high level. And it was sort of like there was this weird hunger for me at that stage of my career of, to your point, what do I translate or how do I know what I'm doing is just really based on good science and evidence. And so I find in our work at LEAP in Chicago, it's not a lack of a willingness by teachers or principals. There almost is a hunger. But where do you translate and where do you find some good stuff to bring in so they can actually use things that are really based on evidence that will change things? And to Steve's point, these little parts around greeting them at the door or whatever can really have an impact. But someone's got to tell them. And especially once you're actually practicing teachers, there's even sort of less of the upskilling and learning along with the field. And so a lot of where you just kind of bring that in, continuous improvement and learning as a teaching professional and as a school.
Yeah. Melissa, you have aha moments all the time. We work together very closely, and I feel like every time we talk, it's an aha moment. But what was your biggest aha moment about the power of science in all of this?
Well, Michael, you just took away what I was going to say, which is, I think there's two aha moments, and that what I find is now that I look at the work through this particular lens, I am excited about the aha moments we see every single place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But my first aha moment was, I think, when I became a principal. And I realized this culture of belonging one creates in a classroom is then scaled up when you're leading a school. And that takes different kind of work than in a classroom work to create sense of belonging in a community of people with 1,100 kids and all these adults kind of working together. And what is a leadership point of view one needs to have to actually exercise that? And then I think secondly, aha was then leading systems of schools, right? So when you are the person who gets to lead systems of schools, where that was 17 when I was KIP and now 116 with DC Public Schools. How do you create conditions for people in classrooms and schools and central offices to have these moments of gratifying ahas all the time? And how do you create space where people's perception of what they see in their classroom or in their schools and how they can match evidence-based action to those particular places so your readiness level and the opportunity level actually come together with the right sort of framework so that you're able to see those aha moments, right? So I think part of the ahas that I get to see every single day is that when we address the emotional ability of kids, they do better in school, right? They're much more open to that. We partnered with Turnaround for Children in my last two organizations, and the aha is there's a structure and a system for scaling that up within your classroom, within your school, within the system. And this is no longer in 2019 a black box where you need to make it up on your own. There is enough bodies of research and guides and tools and assessment tools to help you figure out what should your first step be in leading a classroom in our school or a system. What is then the next cascade of actions that you kind of pull to make that happen? And specifically, some of the ahas is that in some of our schools where we're actually really focusing on this, the amount of just quick data points that would be able to actually capture some of the growth, as in suspension rates cut in by 50% and or more, is often kind of an aha moment. Levels of schools, right now we're all under ESSA, right, no longer NCLB. So in DC, that gives to us like star ratings. So every single school in DC either is a 1-star school, you're not doing so well, or you're a 5-star school. And lots of our 1-star schools, or schools that you would expect to become 1-star schools because of the demographics, the region where that particular school is or not, are not 1-star schools when they are actually becoming SEL-focused schools, right? So none of our schools that actually work and prioritize this work have become a 1-star designated school because of the fact that they started in addressing like the social emotional needs of their kids. And frankly, you can't address that unless you're addressing the social emotional needs of the adults who interface with them all the time. So another aha is, what do we need to do to make sure that the adults who interface with their kids every day also feel this sense of belonging, that they have purpose beyond their job, they have purpose in how they engage with others, so that they, even in very stressful jobs like teaching jobs or leadership jobs, are finding joy and moments of happiness with each other because of that sense of belonging. And right. I think part of, once you start seeing those aha moments, it's hard to not see it. And maybe you just get trained to look for those patterns of recognition.
And Melissa, your title is quite literally what the research says. Social, emotional, and academic development all integrated together. I don't know if there's another role around the country that says that.
There's a few, but there's not enough. And I hope that there's more and more of those, right? So what we traditionally see in school districts is, we're just focused on the data. We really need to make these measurable benchmarks come together. And I think part of naming that, the way to accelerate that and exponentially make not just minimal changes for the experiences of our students and their families, is to actually intentionally marry and merge all of those components of both emotional constancy and availability to the academics, because, as all of you guys know, we are one being, we are one sort of brain, and to artificially separate that only creates yet another hurdle that one has to get over to help our kids reach their potential. And why? They don't need another hurdle. Our adults don't need another hurdle. Actually, what's natural is to actually think about them as integrated, which is what we are.
Conflict.
Oh, dang.
Conflict.
We need more hurdles.
We'll get to that. We know
The good types
you'll
of
talk
hurdles.
challenge
right.
and
You're
rigor
right. I like
a
that.
whole bunch in a minute here, but
Yes.
that's a great point. Melissa, one last thing. One of our partner schools, Henley Elementary School, has been a persistently dangerous school, high levels of suspension, really challenging community there. After a couple of years of focusing on social, emotional, culture, climate work, they've just now had a big announcement this year.
Yeah, several. I mean, this is particularly one of our most challenged schools. I'm sure in all of your cities, you can think of a school that is in the most disparate portion of your location, that is filled with students and families that don't often get highlighted for all of their good work, let alone good productive struggle and or creation of a new sort of learning. But within 2 years, they were able to, my favorite data point is not that they closed the achievement gap by double-digit numbers 2 years in a row consistently, not that they're retaining teachers at bigger rates than ever before, but that the student satisfaction data was at a 50% before the work, and now they hit 90s, and they're now in the 80s, the principal's working on it, but hugely improved from where they were 2 years ago. And also, they're now one of our district's distinguished schools for innovation, because now that they're a place where they're creating new learning and making things and being creators of their space and seeing themselves as leaders in ways that they didn't 2 years ago, right? and that's certainly with good productive struggle. And that's just 2 years' time. And I'm sure that I know that there's been lots of hurdles, and there will continue to be hurdles and good barriers. But when you are in it together and you feel like you are worthy, and this community is worthy, and they are finding great connections with each other and with teachers, the world, anything's possible.
They've been a great partner of ours too, and just thinking about creating the conditions necessary to do innovations like their STEM program, their robotics program, et cetera. Now, Chris, at the risk of being escorted off of the chair here and walked out of the building, I have a confession to make. When I taught middle school 15 years ago, I had 4 computers in my classroom, and I thought the best thing that I could possibly do was unplug them. And I know that's not a thing that we should say at this conference now, but you spend your time thinking about teachers like me and trying to figure out how innovation and technology can be accessible for them and they can integrate it into their practice as opposed to being afraid of it. Tell us about that.
So I think it starts with just an intentionality of caring about learning science and an evidence base. When we first started the work in Chicago and previous my career, there was just a proliferation of technology in K12, freemium models and access. And I find a lot of it is just cleaning house because it's so easy to just go in and grab an OER type of thing or something that's free and use it. And there almost is like a parallel with fake news. Like there's a lot of gamification, so you can bring something in that'll really engage the kids, but is there any depth and rigor underneath it? Are they really learning, or are they just watching videos and getting coins and getting some dings and whatever that might look like? And so it starts for us, on just teaching teachers how to be smart consumers. And I'll go back to my own training. I didn't learn that in my own training. And so let's start with what is the good practice, what are the guidelines that we look like. We have the LEAP Learning Framework, which kind of have these evidence-based guidelines for vetting technology and practice and curriculum. We also do a lot of vetting of technology. Companies will apply to us. They go through a kind of a rigorous third-party panel vetting. ST Math is one of those. But that panel is made up of teachers, so we know it's practitioner-based, but also cognitive psychologists, math specialists, ELA specialists, interface design, because it's complex. The translation into technology is real. And what does that look like also at the second grade level versus the high school level and moving through? But it just comes down to, are you a critical consumer? The last thing I would say, in a very simple sense, just ask the company, what is your evidence base? And usually that's really black and white for us because they come in, they have nothing. They just are making stuff up. Or they might have a theory of action, which is great. You're trying to figure it out. But it's such a clear dichotomy in the field of people that are sort of almost mirrors and smoke. And it's a really nice, beautiful interface. But the way we say it, like, you don't necessarily want Hollywood in your classroom. You want good, rigorous instruction and that hurdles or that movement within your activity. And also teacher augmentation is real. It was great to hear Michael Moe mention that last night. We look at that really strongly. If you're designing ed tech without a teacher, it's just like, what are you thinking? The more you empower the teacher. Yeah, unplug it and get it out of there because you're literally doing harm to kids. You're separating, there's isolation. When I go in the classroom and you got a bunch of kids with headphones on and they're not talking, that's really concerning. You go to school to interact and be part of a community, be part of a belonging and build those social skills. And so we really need to be intentional around what are we designing and what are we using with our children that is empowering the teacher. Next step, I think, really is empowering parents. And for us, we call it learner-led, empowering students. How can they self-reflect, metacognition, set goals, and really understand what they're learning? Some of the early technologies, 5 years ago, you were like a hamster in a wheel. You're just doing problems. Kids had no idea what they were doing. They were just chasing the next coin. And it was just like, hold up, time out. We need to take a step back as a society around what we're doing and stop chasing the glamour and really what is good ed tech design and pedagogy. And sometimes the answer is just not technology.
Powerful. Matthew, you spent tons of time thinking about challenge, rigor, conflict, hurdles. Tell us about that, but particularly around the context and conditions that are necessary to support students taking those risks that you want them to do when they jump over those hurdles.
Yeah, challenge is critical. If you're not being challenged, you are not learning. And that, when I start off trying to make computer games to teach things, math, and your instincts are making it fun and trying to avoid things that are too hard. And it turns out that, I have produced games that literally resulted in a decreased understanding of math after playing the game. It has happened and it can happen.
Real.
It's real. And
This is a confessional. We're all saying our dirty laundry here.
And the key to doing it is challenge, but it has to be good challenge. And so the challenge that you're looking for, you're saying, what are the conditions? It should be tantalizingly tricky. It should make you not like tedious. That tedious is rarely good, sometimes. But if something is really hard, but you're like, I don't want to give up because I want to see if I can do it.
Yeah.
Those are usually the best circumstances for this productive struggle.
Yeah.
And I usually in classrooms see that teachers rarely can tell the difference between something that's productively, where students productively struggle.
What are the signs of that? How do you know?
One of the signs is, are they doing the same thing over and over again? If they're doing the same thing over and over again, that is not productive. And Shakira said it really well in her song, Try Everything. I forgot the name of the song from Zootopia. It's a great song. Shakira was dead on. She was dead on. Don't try the same thing over and over again. Try different things. So if the student is coming up with trying different solutions, they're usually in a productive space. That's one of the things.
Got it.
Yeah.
And Steve, you want to jump in here, and then I have a push for you as well.
I think just that there's sometimes this misconception that social emotional learning means less rigor, because they get this title like soft skills. It doesn't mean less rigor. It's a condition. You're setting the conditions for learning. It does not impact necessarily the rigor in your classroom at all. And I don't think there's also the sense that, well, technology doesn't fit. You really need to be human-oriented and relationship-oriented. That's true. You need to be human-oriented and relationship-oriented, but it doesn't mean that you can't integrate technology at the right spot. So I just, you get this sense that there's this kind of conflict, there's this tension. Not really, I don't think.
Yeah, and we've partnered with you all to put out 20-plus videos, really trying to connect the science to the practice on Edutopia's website. And not only do you put out content, but you also are constantly learning from educators themselves. What are they hearing? What are their beliefs? What are they connecting with? What have you learned about the narratives that are out there and what teachers want from the science?
Geez, there's so much. So we listen, I was just talking last night to our social media team and asking about some of the metrics. So last year, we got about 400,000 teacher comments, about 4.3 million teacher reactions. We do two things at Edutopia. One is we try to identify things that work in education and then show them. So we go in with video teams or we write about them or we report on them. And then we listen very intently to what teachers are saying, and we kind of try to take that qualitative data set and try to learn from it. One of the things obviously we're seeing a lot, and we saw in the SOLD series, the Science of Learning and Development, How Learning Happens was this 23 video series, is that relationships are key. We hear this, it's a kind of maxim, you hear it over and over again. It's often, expressed as Maslow before Bloom, human needs before kind of higher order thinking. That's probably the thing I hear most. That's the narrative that's most clear. The SEL movement is very big right now, and we're also hearing a lot about trauma-informed teaching. Mostly that an understanding of the kind of adverse childhood experiences in your classroom, the challenges and struggles that your students face, is critical to making sure that everyone in the classroom makes progress. But the good news is that you hear some criticism of this. Well, if you're focusing on the kids that are struggling, you may be bringing down the high performers. It turns out actually that good trauma-informed teaching actually raises all learners because it's focused on those fundamental principles that if you can get kids to feel like they belong in the classroom, whatever their challenge is, they're much, much more likely to actually produce high academic outcomes. That does not seem to be they don't seem to follow naturally. That's why I was confused when I came from my own high school teaching background. I was like, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. I'd make one more comment, and this is from my own perspective as I listen and I watch and I'm trying to make sense of the world around social emotional learning and academic achievement. The number of times I've seen the fragility question come up. So there's also a question of at the high school and college level in particular, the fragility around belonging is quite high. So it doesn't take much to kick a kid off of that sense of belonging, that kind of even keel in their school system. And they'll drop out pretty quickly. There's a pretty good research starting to emerge around the fact that kids leave college at relatively high rates, not because they're not able to achieve academically, but because there's some moment in which they feel profoundly ostracized, and they leave.
Wow, that's powerful. And as I think about this whole child personalization driven by science, there can be a narrative about technology and personalization that it's all about technology, when personalization is really a broader concept of understanding each and every child and meeting their needs so that they can actually ultimately succeed. The flip side of this conversation is a worry that many of us have about equity and making sure that innovation and technology are actually used to promote equity and don't actually further the gaps that are there already. And so I want to use this as a possible moment of conflict, maybe not amongst yourselves, but in the movement writ large. What are your biggest worries about equity considerations in the space of personalization, innovation, et cetera? How can we make sure that we're not exacerbating the problem by giving students who are already high performing even more access to innovation and technology, and making sure we don't start a narrative of, so those kids growing up in poverty, see, it wasn't going to work for them anyway. That's not what they need. What are the big equity considerations that you have?
I have the opposite concern. I feel that students who are high performing are being pulled down by a lot of these, by technology and things like that, where there is not high ceilings. Often it's what I see is through technology, such low ceilings that we need to support students who are struggling, but we also need to give ample room for growth for students who are already, high achievers. And so I see almost the opposite.
Yeah.
Michael, there's a book called The Teaching Gap, kind of an old book, but basically the premise of this book is that basically we are recreating the cultures around what learning and achievement is, and it looks differently in different countries about what we think about the place of school and learning and education might be. And in our country, certainly Washington, D.C., we, without intentionally trying to recreate that to produce a different sort of result, our machine of public education is creating the sort of racial and economic disparities so that and the bell curve will continue to go on, right? So even though we're much more knowledgeable today, and we know that we don't want to recreate futures for our students that we have for ourselves, that doesn't happen just because we feel and hope that it will happen. What we actually need to do is to put that equity lens on every structure we have built, every structure that has advantaged many of us, because we figured out how to work that structure. We succeeded in this particular structure, but how do we become more vulnerable to question every sort of assumption about who leads what, whose voice gets listened to as our researchers think about this, and where is the role of the teacher and or the student voice in a lot of this work. So I think the question about how do we think about equitable sort of access, I think is intertwined in everything about education, how we engage. And I think I completely agree with you, even though I want to disagree with you, that I think our ceiling is too low, for sure. But I also think our floor is too low, right? Our expectation of what our kids should be able to do is it's embarrassing. It's just really embarrassing. What I know I was asked to do as a youngster in middle school, whether that is part as a member of a family unit or kind of being part of touchable sort of experiences in schools, one example might be junior achievement or other things that says, here's a problem, fix it. You might not have the best answer to that, but it's certainly worthy of your time to have that productive struggle and go through what the whole sort of process might be to become an entrepreneur, to think outside the box and have a solution for something you don't have. Our schools don't naturally have that, right? We don't create times for teachers to say, let's get to know you and then figure out what might make you tick and have you figure that out. Maybe in some of our independent schools, maybe in some very unique spaces, but the systematized way of actually valuing that time for that teacher and or for that student doesn't exist. So I think part of the equity sort of question you pose is how do we reimagine and redesign schools? How do we create either turnaround school experiences and or new start creation schools? And from my vantage point, how do I train up a whole bunch of teacher leaders and assistant principals that will soon become the principals leading our schools, that will hopefully replace me in my job and do other things? And how do they not get to learn about this lens the way I kind of stumbled upon it, right? I stumbled upon this. I kind of figured this out on my own, and leaving that to chance for our kids isn't enough. And thankfully, shameless plug of Turnaround for Children, I mean, they have, if you are a system leader or supporting schools, they have demystified the magic of creating what comes first, second, and third. I think it's certainly worthy of everyone in this room to kind of pick up the article, some of the sold sort of work, to kind of interface it with that way, and then actually look at the SEAT tool that many of our schools now have started to use to figure out what are the steps, because it shouldn't be as chancy as it currently is, and I think that's the way to kind of get at some of the equity issues.
And since you are the voice of the work on the ground right now, let's get a little more specific. What are some of those systems and practices that you've noticed over the years that have reproduced inequity, both racial gaps, socioeconomic gaps? You've spoken eloquently about this before, just piercing through the fog of this so that we can really understand what are the systems and practices that are continuing to promote those gaps.
I mean, one easy sort of, it's a tangled sort of knot, this thing called public education. And I don't think it really matters which entry point that you find to get in, but I think about it as like this tangled knot, pick the issue, and I think the issue that is easy to kind of think about all this is around student discipline and culture and climate, right? Look at your school district and or school that your child attends and just ask the questions about what kind of actions create a negative sort of response. Who gets that negative sort of response? How often do they get it? Place yourself, and I would encourage all of you to actually be a student for a day. Part of the ways that I got to this is requiring all of our people to shadow a student for a day, particularly in your middle and or high schools, and spend the day, be that kid, and see how hard it is to sit still and focus and pay attention and look like you care about a darn thing that's happening in those classrooms. It is next to impossible. No one asks us as adults to be what we are asking our students to be. Yet this is what education looks like, right? Our cultural norms, going back to the teaching gap, says that's what classrooms should look like, this is what schools should be. So in order for us to actually change that, for many of you in this room who have the opportunity to recreate that in some way, what then would you want it to be, right? I think part of my other aha moments is, we are now in, 2019, been doing this for some decades now, and I look back at my closet moments where I created schools and classrooms that I thought were right for other people's children. And I think part of my new work in life is to kind of pay penance for all that I did in my first 2 decades. To say I did some things that I thought was in the best interest of students, and everyone told me it was the right thing to do. But looking systematically back at those kind of actions, the systems that it created actually were systems that I want nothing to do with my own children, right? Like, none of those experiences are valuable for my own kids. And the fact that I was such a large part as a leader in our city in helping you to create some of those structures, I gotta work triple hard to undo, right? And how do we get at that? How do you get at that individually from your seats? And the sphere of influence you have in your sort of industry or your particular civic engagement space might be very different from mine. But I think when you think about what systems can I help to change by asking sometimes just good questions, probing questions, scratching 2 levels deeper than what often civilized conversations have us talk about schools and our education sort of system, will certainly create an uncomfortable space. But part of what I think great leaders do, school leaders, system leaders, is to engage with you and take those several layers of deeper scratches, and how they answer that should kind of show kind of their thinking perspective on this and how progressive they might be or where they might stand. And I hope you engage in that productive struggle of turning this around, because our citizenry are the ones that are influencing how our schools act, right? We don't often listen enough to the voices of students We certainly don't listen to voices of teachers, but many times we do listen to voices of community members, funders, and parents who are loud. And so use your voice. Be loud for people that are out, not just your children, because sometimes your children might be fine, but those other people's kids might not be so fine.
Matthew, I think of adults don't stop needing to have that hurdle when they turn 18. We all need to have those tough conversations, those challenges as well. Chris, you were going to jump in about some of this too.
Yeah, to build on that, on the equity piece, I find there's mindset, which is a really big concern for us in our work around just who is deserving of this. Often comes to fruition in terms of just an opportunity gap. So self-actualization is a big sort of theory of learning that we believe in a lot, of students understanding themselves, their identity, taking ownership, and then having opportunities to navigate and be active in their education. And so when you talk to your systems, we've seen things, especially with No Child Left Behind, you have this big swing towards test prep, and then in your high needs communities, this sense of conscious or unconscious, these kids not being deserving of higher order thinking and projects because you just got to get right on the test. And then these bad practices pulling into it. And so when you think more actively, when you go in there, does that group of students have a chance to make choices? There's an equity lens of just ownership. Or am I always being told by an adult what to do every day, every minute? And so when I graduate, how do you expect me to navigate and be ready for that? So there's a lot of building that. I'd also say identity has just really risen to be huge in the work. And I think it was one aha moment for me of, great, we want to help these kids make choices, but if their own self-identity is that I could never be a scientist, or I could never be this, or this is my path in life, or they lack a growth mindset, you got to unpack that. You got to target that. You got to go deep. You got to go deep on that with your staff. Same thing. I think teacher growth mindset is really critical, and struggle and all of that. And the last thing I would say is from an equity lens of teachers and principals, and giving them a real sense of autonomy and empowerment. Because the other thing we've seen in Chicago is if you have like a top-down mandate kind of stuff, people are not empowered, and you're not going to make the change. But if you flip it around and really grassroots effort, help people understand that and their children what they're trying to do, you can really have a significant impact. But you have to acknowledge that it's going to look different in every classroom, in every school, put some level of trust in the adults, and build their growth mindset, identity, and what their role is, so they're not just always being told what to do. I was sharing with her prior to, early in the work, we had a lot of people being like, Chris, tell me what to do. We're like, we're not here to tell you what to do, because I don't know what to do. You know your kids and community and 1,000 times better than I do, but their identity as a teacher or principal was so much about, I'm going to follow the mandate. So you had to flip the script on that, work with the district and TPS and everyone that has been amazing. Really, okay, how do we empower and train in communities of practice around learning science and what this looks like to move it forward? But identity is really key, and just, I always say, put a GoPro cam on a kid's head or shadow them for a day, and how often does like little baby Chris actually get a chance to make choices and self-reflect? How often does he see his cultures reflected in what he's reading, sense of empowerment? That's all real, and it can reinforce in wonderful ways, or it can reinforce in just really destructive ways.
And as we think about these narratives and stories that we tell, Steve, how do you imagine equity being a key consideration as we move forward into this work on science? You're hearing from educators all the time. How are they grappling with some of these issues too?
So first, on the question of personalization that came before, I think there's a lot of confusion around personalization right now. I don't think, a couple years ago, this was all the rage. Everyone was talking about it. You had Summit schools out there really pushing it. What I've seen recently is a lot of teachers saying, I really don't know what this means. I don't really understand it as different than differentiation, which is a really old concept inside schools. What's different about personalization? And why should I sit my kid in front of a computer for a self-pacing exercise? Whether that's right or not, that's what I'm hearing. Yeah, and it may well be
Conflict.
But so a couple of systems that I think are perpetuated inside schools, we've seen the research on them is, in discipline, clearly, where the research is really, I think, crystal clear that, for example, boys, and African-American boys in particular, are experiencing greater discipline for the same type of activities as white kids, for example. And then in STEM, we see this a lot as well, and we just did an article on this where if you ask young girls, do you want to be an engineer, there's kind of like a maybe I want to be an engineer. if you kind of reframe science around big questions of humanity, like would you like to help bring water to poor nations? Would you like to design irrigation systems? Girls are much more likely to step up and say, yeah, I do want to do that. Well, that's the same question, really. So there are kind of entrenched ways that we approach some of these subject areas that aren't particularly effective anymore, and are carrying and kind of perpetuating in invisible ways some of the inequities culture that we see generally. So those are two big ideas that kind of jump up from the work from listening to our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that I think has come up in this conference this week is the notion of reform and transformation. So as we think about the implications of the science of how we do school, in each of your opinions, is this a moment for reform? Is this a moment for transformation? How big is the scale of change that the science is implicating for us to be able to do right now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was talking to, I don't know if you know Mitch Resnick over at MIT, but I was talking to him a while ago, and I feel like he said something that resonated with me a lot, which was, we need to really reimagine schools and break down the barriers between classrooms, break down the barriers between periods, because you need more time to get something substantive done. Break down the barriers between our schools and inside of schools and outside of schools, because when kids don't feel like they're part of a relevant project that actually makes an impact in the world, well, that seems like no longer consistent with the ethos in our work environments in the 21st century. Break down the barriers between subject areas, because you need to really understand how mathematics and English actually do work together. Statistical analysis and writing about statistics.
We don't even do math and science.
Yeah. So the question really, what I don't think is true is that we should just junk the old system entirely. Yeah. I do think there's room for standardized testing. I know that those are ugly words for many teachers, but there's room for it if it's proportional and thoughtful. And I think there's room for subject area focus. But it seems odd to me still that as we kind of stare down the barrel of the 21st century, we're not talking about more interdisciplinary work, that we're not talking about project-based work, that we're not talking about, Matthew, which you mentioned before, the actual work product and the fact that kids need to actually produce something and not simply learn.
And they have to have choice. Like what Chris says, you have to have choice what you produce.
Certainly, yes.
And that's a lot of the problem with the project-based learning. No, people are talking about project-based learning. Mm-hmm. It's just the rigor is way down, the choice is way down, you're following recipes, and that's like opposite of what you want to be doing in project-based learning.
Matthew, you said big.
Mm-hmm. Big,
when
huge.
I asked the question.
Yeah, so
what are the implications of the science here? What do you mean big?
There's so much. We are in the dark ages right now in education. I believe it. We teach students coming out of our school system, only 30% only are proficient in math. Yeah. And we've been focusing on this and trying to make an impact on it, and we haven't really moved the needle. We should be having school system with all this money we have and this advanced technology. Every student should be coming out of the school system proficient in every subject area. And why aren't we there? We have a long ways to go.
Yeah. Chris, transformation, reform, are we tweaking, or do we need to rethink the system?
The word that comes to mind for me is evolution. Chris Deedy at Harvard has a framework for scaling innovation in education, and it was a bit of a light bulb for me because the language is not adoption, because that almost assumes there's a silver bullet or a single thing. It is adaptation. And I think almost living the ethos of like personalized learning, each community and values and curriculum, they have their own set. So you need to honor that, not have a deficit mindset to what they are, bring that to the table, and then think about how do I adapt school to what we know to make it happen. So there is a real translation though around, you go into a school and you see learning styles and all these things that are clearly from the dark ages, and you're like, we know this doesn't work. How do we clean house on that? Be very intentional on getting rid of these and this, not just grabbing stuff from the internet, and just be like, is this evidence-based research? How do we do this? What are the systems of the curriculum? How do I empower my teachers? So there's an irony to it, because I feel like we know what to do, but we just gotta get there to evolve schools. But anything reform I almost react to, because it almost seems like such a top-down mandate. Yeah. Some of my previous work was New Orleans. It was just, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't respect the people on the ground. But if you flip around the evolution and you really bring in the communities and others to it, I think you can have a really magical recipe. And we've seen some amazing impact in Chicago of schools just got it, and they are moving. But it's like a learning science of improvement. So every month you go back there and like they're better and they're better and they're better, and they're like now lifelong learners as a staff, and that trickles down to the kids. And so it's you're never really done. But I think how do you create this muscle for continuous improvement in education is where the magic's going to happen.
Yeah, and it's easy for the four of us to talk about huge changes. Melissa, you're in the system right now. You're the man. How do you think of this moment for us?
I was having like a little PTSD moment. My anxiety was going up. I was like, oh. Because I think it is going back to the culture of how the school is situated in our communities and kind of learning the education reform lessons of the last 20 years. I think all of us, even though we might be in conflict about some things, I bet many of us would agree that doing things to people without their engagement is probably one of the biggest lessons learned from the ed reform sort of time. So as we think about recreating the space of continuous learning and how do we make ourselves and our children lifelong learners, I think it's about like where does the locus of power go, right? Who gets to decide that narrative? And how many people, who do we listen to? Whose voices matter? Who gets that sort of ownership of this problem? And it's hard to do as a person sitting in power, right? Like I own all 116 schools, every single program, every single principal somehow all directs, it's a huge pyramid of things. But even, particularly because of that, I think trying to slow the process down a little bit to create intentional spaces, maybe not perfect yet, but more than there was before, so that more people wrestle with this problem. And they see this problem as our problem, I think is certainly the perspective we are in DC public schools adopting, because, one of the things we hear all the time, we're just launching this new work starting next school year to redesign 2 of our high schools in the most disparate, farthest from opportunity spaces in our city. And many people, when I tell them that, they're like, what is wrong with you? What do you mean you're going to redesign these 2 schools? Well, we're redesigning these schools because that's where our children need us the most. And many folks would expect me and people who work on my team to have like kind of an answer for what our redesign of these schools to be. And we are intentionally not starting it with an answer and intentionally kind of taking a slower pathway to engage our parents and communities, both little c and big C, to kind of reimagine what this sort of space should be, what the students should come out of this experience as. And we're talking to all the feeder middle schools and elementary schools in this region of the city to kind of do this work with us. And our bet there is that because enough people have owned this problem together, that we will have we're at a better place to truly transform, reimagine, redesign, whatever word you want to use, because it will hopefully have lots of people's sort of input and buy-in and their ownership of this thing, so that if it goes off course or things are not well, it will not be because one of us did this, but because many of us had many engagements to do this, so that they will help us with this. I don't know if anyone knows about Rosenwald schools, which is another thing you guys should look up. There's a great documentary about this awesome dude, Julius Rosenwald, and kind of how he created these community-based schools all across the country, actually. And so I think we're taking a little bit of page from history in that and entering this space in this way. And, is it the winning strategy? I don't know. But I think that is a bet that we're using. And I think thinking about building resilience in our trauma-based approach, because, Michael and I talked about this, like when we talk a lot about ACEs and trauma-based education, I don't know, 75% of that conversation is really about the resiliency of educators and kids who figure out how to move past that, right? Like, trauma-based doesn't mean we just understand your trauma and where you're at and all of the many ways that many of our students and our teachers, frankly, are taxed. It's about how do you move from that particular space and get stronger as a result and come up with different coping mechanisms and next steps. And so we're trying to merge all of that together in these 2 redesigns and, come visit us.
So
voice.
As we think about wrapping up, this is the 10th summit. Imagining the 20th summit, we've come back together. Some of us have a little less hair. Some of us have had some more scars or wounds. What is one hope or one worry that you have about the next 10 years in incorporating the science of learning into everything that we're doing? Matthew, I'll start off with you. One hope or one worry?
I am fearful that rigor and challenge will continue to go down. I saw these new awesome AR apps and VR apps, and there's less learning there than there is on a worksheet, which I despise. And it's just, I think it's the trend is that way of it's just terrible. So if 10 years from now there's some new fancy technology where students can learn by not having to do anything, where really there's no learning happening, that is my biggest fear.
All right, Steve, one hope, one worry for 10 years from now.
Oh, I don't know. Like I hope it's not the same. That's my big worry. To me, just looking forward, I know there's some pushback on project-based learning, things of that nature. It seems to me that high schools are kind of particularly resistant to change, and I would really love to see some fundamental changes there. I don't think kids are getting good choices there. I think they're checking out. I think they're not learning a lot. I think we're not poised to graduate kids who are going to be successful and feel like they have control of their lives and control of their destiny. So I think there does need to be fundamental change, particularly at that level. Obviously I can't see all the cards, but I'd hate to come back and think it still looks exactly the same. We're still locked inside our little boxes as teachers, inside our bigger boxes, inside the schools, inside the slightly larger boxes in the districts, and operating in the same way. That would be terrifying to me.
Chris, one hope or one worry?
I hope we just engage in discourse and discussion, just as a nation itself. It's been kind of a theme running the last few days, but in education, it's not just learning science is right or wrong, or personalized learning is right or wrong, like SEL, right or wrong, like getting deeper into it and really unpacking it. I think that's one thing even as LEAP as a staff and with those we work with in Chicago, people come in with all these conceptions and you gotta go deep and really figure out, do you agree, do you disagree, where are we at? Project-based learning, like it? Is it Swiss cheese or what is this thing? And get into that so that as we move forward, people just care about what works and what has evidence base. Again, I find a lot of parallels to fake news, and you can be like, this feels great, it's shiny, whatever, go with it, versus peel the onion, and is there anything there? Is it from a reliable resource? And if education just made that one pivot and shift to be a little bit more critical, I think it could be a game changer, so that in the same way we walk in and we see these AR, VR things, and we're like, come on, people. I would love everyone in education to go in and see that and just see that, that's just light cover. What's the real rigor and experience we're trying to create for kids as lifelong learners?
Great. And Melissa, bring us home. I'm going to push you to have a hope, if possible.
Well, yes, my hope is actually, yeah, exactly, extremes. Yeah. My hope is actually something that really stuck with me in sitting in a session with Dr. Pam Cantor, who's in the back of the room. She came to talk with me and a bunch of other sort of school leaders, and during her talk, she said something about these words that just stuck with me. Creating wildly productive and joyful classrooms is the hope that I'm aiming for, whether that looks like some merger of technology or things that I don't even know that's around the corner now. I don't care what that looks like, but I think we can all see what wildly productive and joyful spaces where people are engaging and respecting one another and just kind of synergistically spurring on new thoughts and questions as a result. That is the hope. And I think we do that by making our people feel as whole as they can, and that we create a system of structures where both from the district level, but certainly from the community level, help our educators feel whole, so they're in a place to have a larger, generous spirit for the little people they engage with every day.
Perfect. Awesome. Big round of applause for our panel here. Thank you all very much. And thank you all. We appreciate it. All right.